The ROG Ally has a 7-inch, 1920 by 1080 120Hz IPS LCD touchscreen. The display supports a variable refresh rate with a 48 to 120 Hz refresh window, and below that limit, low frame rate compensation kicks in. The display supports 8-bit color with full sRGB coverage, 500 nits peak brightness, 7 milliseconds response times, but no HDR. The display on the ROG Ally is quite good. You get very good color performance out of the box with a reasonably accurate white point and color saturation. Viewing angles are also good, and the display gets fairly bright to be usable outdoors, but there is no automatic brightness adjustment, so you have to change it manually every time. Response time performance is also decent, and there was no motion trailing or inverse ghosting happening. The touchscreen also felt responsive. The display has 60 Hz and 120 Hz modes, and you can quickly toggle between the two through the command center. Switching to 60 Hz doesn't bring so much power savings, and you'd be losing the VRR feature, so it's not worth bothering with. You can also toggle between 720p and 1080p, but again, it's not worth using as it's better to reduce in-game rendering resolution or use image upscaling technologies like FSR, as they maintain the HUD resolution and upscale the rendered image. The display quality and performance on the ROG Ally are certainly on a whole different level compared to the Steam Deck. You get higher resolution, higher refresh rates, and better color performance. It makes Valve's decision to go with a bargain basement panel seem even more glaring. However, the Ally display still cannot compete with that of the Switch OLED in terms of sheer image quality. The infinite contrast and perfect blacks of the OLED cannot be beaten, and the ROG Ally panel certainly still has the telltale gray blacks that LCD panels cannot get rid of. OLED panels also have better response times, and while the Ally panel is certainly no slouch, less than 1 millisecond is better than 7 milliseconds. Now for the audio. The ROG Ally has a set of forward-facing stereo speakers. The speakers get plenty loud but are a bit too bright and tinny by default. The Dolby Atmos app helps with this, and you can get a more balanced sound with a wider soundstage. Overall, the speakers can sound pretty good, and while I would still recommend using headphones, you can get away with using the speakers for casual gaming. The Ally also has built-in microphones. These can come in quite handy for in-game voice chat as well as Discord calls. There is no camera, however, so the calls have to be strictly voice-only, which is fine. The ROG Ally can be used in 5 different performance modes. The first 3 are Silent, Performance, and Turbo, which can be quickly toggled through Asus's overlay. You can also create a manual profile with custom power limits and fan profiles, and finally, you can also use the default Windows performance profile where the OS handles the power limits and fans. The first 3 modes are the most relevant ones here. The Silent mode targets 10W, and the Performance mode targets 15W. The Turbo mode works at 25W on battery but switches to the 30W mode when plugged into a power adapter rated for 65W or higher. The rated numbers are only rough indicators of how much power will be consumed. The 10W mode can pull as high as 15W, the 15W can pull upwards of 20W, and the 30W mode can go as high as 50W. They can also pull less than the rated numbers depending on the load. For my testing, I focused on the 15W and 30W modes. The 15W mode makes the most sense for portable use on battery power, while the 30W mode makes the most sense when plugged into power. The 10W mode has very limited use as it greatly starves the chip of power, and outside of 2D visual novels and side-scrolling platformers, there aren't many other genres that can be played at this power mode without incurring heavy performance losses. The 25W mode on battery also doesn't make much sense, as you will be using way too much energy, and the ROG Ally doesn't exactly have the battery capacity to deal with such a power draw. All testing below was done at 1080p at medium settings or equivalent. All games were run with the API that performed the best, which in most cases was DirectX 12 except in rare cases like Fortnite and Control, where DirectX 11 performed better. All testing was done with BIOS version 3.22, which was the latest at the time of testing. A newer version 3.23 was available at the time of publishing. However, all testing had been completed by that time, so any changes it brings over 322 are not covered in this review. When operating at the 30W mode, the ROG Ally often provided a performance that exceeded the base PS4. This was especially evident when testing Sony's first-party titles such as God of War, Death Stranding, and Horizon Zero Dawn at 1080p using console-equivalent settings, where the Ally was often comfortably over the 30 frames per second mark that the PS4 ran at in these games. At 15W, the Ally gets close to PS4 performance, which is not bad considering the inefficiencies of using DirectX as compared to the native APIs that games can use on the consoles. Compared to the Steam Deck, the ROG Ally is much more powerful. The GPU is a generation newer, and the CPU is 2 generations newer. Both the memory and SSD are also faster. Not to mention the fact that the Ally can also supply over twice as much power to its APU, and the games are running natively and not through a compatibility layer. When put together, it means that the ROG Ally can offer similar or better performance at 1080p than what the Steam Deck can manage at 720p. The Switch isn't even in the same discussion. Most modern smartphones are more powerful than that hardware. So what's it like playing on the ROG Ally? As mentioned above, you get essentially a PS4-like experience in the palm of your hand when plugged into the wall. This means native 1080p resolution, moderate settings, and a mostly stable 30 frames per second. This might not feel like much to PC nerds, but neither the Steam Deck and certainly not the Switch can come close to matching this experience. At that resolution and even with the reduced settings, games look stunning, and a consistent 30 frames per second frame rate can still provide a perfectly enjoyable experience in many games, especially when you consider what you are playing on. In the 15W portable mode, you have to be more aggressive with reducing settings and enabling image upscaling technologies like FSR to maintain that 30 frames per second. I'm going to be honest, this is not the mode to play big AAA titles with. There isn't enough power to go around for both the CPU and the GPU, and the system prioritizes GPU performance, causing the CPU to struggle. This can be seen in the 1% and 0.1% results, which suffer due to a CPU bottleneck. The 15W mode works best with simpler indie games that look great and run at high frame rates, even with this limited power budget. The ROG Ally has a 40Wh battery that is split into 2 cells. When playing at the 15W mode, the best I could get out of the system was about an hour and a half of gameplay time while using headphones, and the display set to 70% brightness. The less usable 10W mode should fare better, but with a 40Wh battery the best you are looking at is 4 hours, and realistically, it will be lower than that. The battery life puts a dampener on the usability of the device. The testing above was done with an unlocked frame rate and 100% GPU load, but even with frame limiters and reduced settings in place, you aren't looking at more than a couple of hours with the 15W mode, which, once again, I consider the bare minimum for most games. Asus provides a 65W charger in the box that looks more like one of their laptop chargers. The charger takes about an hour and 40 minutes to completely charge the Ally when switched off. There are options in the My Asus app to prevent the battery from charging beyond a certain point to increase its longevity, but that will cut into the already limited battery life.